The Man W. Deppa, The Day Freedom Ended picture. Virginia in the year 1640. There is no United States yet. No Constitution. No Bill of Rights. No Supreme Court. The land is raw, unsettled, brutal, and uncertain. Tobacco fields stretch outward under a hot Atlantic sun, and survival is not guaranteed for anyone. Not for English settlers, not for indentured servants, and certainly not for Africans brought across the ocean in chains. Now imagine 3 men running through those fields at night. They are not soldiers. They are not criminals in the modern sense. They are laborers who have decided they will not labor anymore. They have fled their master's plantation in Virginia. They are attempting escape, not to overthrow the colony, not to start rebellion, simply to leave, to stop being owned. 2 of those men are European indentured servants. The 3rd man is African. His name is John Punch. For days they move northward. We do not know if they whisper. We do not know if they argue. We do not know if they believe they will make it. What we do know is this: they are caught, and when they are dragged back to Jamestown and brought before the Colonial Court, something happens that changes American history forever. The 2 European men receive extended servitude, a few more years added to their contracts. Harsh, yes. Punitive, yes. But temporary. John Punch receives something different. The court rules that he shall serve his master for the time of his natural life. Not extended, not increased, not temporary, for life. This is the first known legal case in English America where a person of African descent is sentenced to lifetime servitude, while Europeans involved in the same offense are not. And with that ruling, something shifts beneath the surface of the colonies. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with speeches or declarations. Quietly, legally, permanently. A line has been drawn, and the man standing at that line is John Punch, the world before racial slavery. To understand why this moment matters, we must step back into a world before race was codified into law, the way we think of it today. Early Virginia was chaotic. Labor was scarce. Death from disease was common. Workers, both European and African, were often brought under indenture contracts. These contracts required years of service in exchange for passage to America. After those years, the servant was supposed to be free. Africans in early Virginia did not immediately enter a fully formed system of racial slavery. Some were indentured. Some eventually gained freedom. Some owned land. The lines were blurred. Hardship was widespread. Class mattered more than race in many early disputes. But the colony needed stability. It needed labor permanence. It needed a predictable workforce that could not simply walk away when contracts expired. The escape of John Punch and the 2 Europeans exposed a dangerous vulnerability. If servants could run and receive similar punishments regardless of origin, the labor system remained unstable. So the court made a choice. Not an accident, not confusion, a choice. And that choice was to treat the African man differently. John Punch became an example. And examples become precedent. The courtroom that shaped the nation. There are no dramatic transcripts from the hearing. No long speeches preserved. Colonial court records were brief and practical, but within those few recorded lines lies the birth of something enormous. The court did not say Africans were slaves. The court did not say Europeans were free. Instead, it created disparity in punishment based on identity. The 2 white servants received 4 additional years. John Punch received life. It was a subtle but decisive escalation, and here's the terrifying part. It did not require violence in that moment. It required paperwork, ink, a ruling. From that point forward, the idea that African labor could be permanent while European labor remained contractual began hardening into custom. Custom becomes law. Law becomes system. System becomes economy. Within decades, Virginia would pass laws declaring that the status of a child followed the condition of the mother, meaning children born to enslaved women would automatically be enslaved. Lifetime servitude became hereditary slavery. Race became embedded in statute. But before that machinery was fully built, there was a man whose name appears only briefly in the records. John Punch. Why his story is so unsettling. We have almost no personal details about him. No recorded words. No description of his face. No age listed. No birthplace confirmed. Just a legal outcome, and that absence is haunting, because it reveals how systems erase individuals. John Punch was not remembered for who he was. He was remembered for what was done to him. He did not become famous. He did not lead revolt. He did not write narrative. He became a legal turning point. The man himself disappears into silence. The precedent survives for centuries. The suspense of what comes next. At this moment in 1640, no one in that courtroom knew they were participating in the foundation of racialized slavery in America. There were no grand declarations, no constitutional conventions, just a colonial court trying to discipline 3 runaway servants. But history is often built exactly that way, in small rulings that accumulate until the structure becomes immovable. What followed John Punch's sentence was not immediate transformation. It was gradual tightening, more distinctions, more laws, more restrictions, more permanence. By the late 1600s, slavery in Virginia would be explicitly racial and hereditary, and when the United States was later formed, that system would already be embedded into its economic and political DNA. The question that disturbed the U.S. Why him? Why did the court decide that the African man deserved lifetime punishment while the Europeans did not? The answer is not complicated, it is structural. The colony was beginning to realize that dividing laborers by race created control. If poor Europeans and Africans saw themselves as allies in hardship, they might unite. But if one group was permanently enslaved and the other eventually free, hierarchy was secured. John Punch's sentence was not merely punitive. It was strategic. It was the quiet beginning of racial separation codified through law. And once written into law, it became self-reinforcing. The long shadow centuries later, genealogists and historians would uncover something extraordinary. Through DNA studies, it was suggested that John Punch may be a distant ancestor of U.S. President Barack Obama through a white Virginia lineage that descended from Punch's enslaver. The symbolism is staggering. A man sentenced to lifetime servitude in 1640, a descendant becoming President of the United States in 2008. The arc of history is rarely linear, but sometimes it is poetic, and yet, before we jump centuries ahead, we must return to the colony, to the fragile decades after Punch's sentencing, because that is where the true transformation unfolds. The system did not appear overnight. It was engineered, tested, adjusted, strengthened, and John Punch was the test case when division became policy. If John Punch's sentence in 1640 was a spark, the decades that followed were the slow construction of a furnace. The transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded through fear, economic anxiety, and deliberate political engineering. Virginia in the mid-1600s was unstable. Wealth concentrated in the hands of large landowners, while poor European servants and African laborers toiled under punishing conditions. Mortality rates were high. Land ownership was limited. Discontent simmered beneath the tobacco fields. At first, race was not yet the primary dividing line. Class tension dominated. Poor Europeans resented wealthy planters just as much as enslaved Africans did. In some instances, they worked side by side. They suffered similar hardships. They shared grievances. That reality posed a problem for the colonial elite. When laborers recognized common oppression, alliances threatened hierarchy. Then came 1676. Bacon's Rebellion erupted when a coalition of discontented colonists, including both European servants and African laborers, challenged the colonial governor. They burned Jamestown. They demonstrated that class-based unity could destabilize the entire power structure. The rebellion terrified Virginia's ruling class, not because of racial difference, but because of cross-racial cooperation. If poor whites and black laborers joined forces again, the plantation elite could lose everything. So the solution was not reconciliation. The solution was separation. After Bacon's Rebellion, the ruling class began codifying racial distinctions with greater clarity. Laws increasingly favored Europeans, even poor Europeans, while hardening the permanent status of Africans. Small privileges were granted to white laborers, lighter punishments, access to land after indenture, legal protections. Meanwhile, African laborers were stripped of pathways to freedom. Division was no longer accidental, it was strategic policy, the making of hereditary slavery. Over the next several decades, Virginia passed laws that transformed temporary servitude into generational bondage. One of the most significant developments came in 1662, when lawmakers declared that a child's legal status would follow the condition of the mother. This doctrine ensured that children born to enslaved women would automatically be enslaved, regardless of the father's identity. The economic implications were enormous. Enslaved women were no longer just laborers. They became sources of future labor. Reproduction became capital. This was not social custom. It was statute. And once hereditary slavery was written into law, permanence became embedded in the system. The distinction that had first appeared in John Punch's sentencing, lifetime servitude for the African man, was no longer an exception. It became the rule. By the early 1700s, Virginia's slave codes were explicit. Africans and their descendants were defined legally as property. Movement was restricted. Education was discouraged. Interracial marriage was outlawed. Testimony in court was limited. The transformation was complete. What began as a differentiated punishment became a racial caste system. How law shaped identity. One of the most chilling aspects of this evolution is how identity itself became legally constructed. In early colonial Virginia, race had not yet solidified into rigid categories. But by the late 17th century, whiteness and blackness were no longer merely descriptive. They were legal statuses with defined rights and restrictions. Poor European servants, once vulnerable and disposable, were gradually absorbed into the category of white. That classification granted them social elevation above Africans. Even if their economic conditions remained difficult, the ruling elite offered them psychological wages, status over black laborers, and it worked. Over time, solidarity fractured. The same plantation fields that once housed mixed grievances now operated under layered hierarchy. Europeans, however poor, had a path upward. Africans did not. John Punch's ruling had signaled the possibility of permanent racial distinction. Bacon's rebellion accelerated its necessity. The slave codes institutionalized it, and the plantation economy flourished under it. The cue at normalization. The most dangerous systems are not those that announce themselves loudly. They are those that normalize slowly. By the early 18th century, children were born into a world where racial slavery was already assumed. They did not witness its creation. They inherited its logic. Generations grew up believing it had always been this way. But history remembers otherwise. There was a time before permanent racial slavery was codified. There was a moment when a court could have chosen differently. There was a man whose lifetime sentence marked the pivot. John Punch did not see the full system take shape. He lived at its origin, but the architecture that emerged after him would define America for centuries. A system that lasted empires. England would change. Monarchs would rise and fall. Colonies would rebel and become a new nation. Revolutions would declare that all men are created equal. And yet the structure solidified in 17th century Virginia endured. The United States Constitution would later accommodate slavery. Compromises would protect it. Laws would expand it westward. Economies would depend on it. When enslaved people were auctioned in the 1800s, the logic behind their status traced back to decisions made in the 1600s. The ink that sentenced John Punch to life did not dry quickly. It spread. Dendershon question. What if the court had punished all three men equally? What if lifetime servitude had not been racialized at that moment? History cannot be rewritten, but understanding contingency matters. Systems are not inevitable. They are constructed, and once constructed, they require maintenance. The slave codes required enforcement. Enforcement required violence. Violence required justification. Justification required ideology. That ideology would evolve into racial theories claiming African inferiority, not because the biology existed first, but because the system required explanation. Law preceded myth, myth justified law. Economy reinforced both. The man lost in the machine. Through all of this, the personal story of John Punch remains silent. Did he have family? Did he witness the tightening restrictions? Did he understand that his punishment was different not only in degree, but in meaning? We do not know. And that absence should unsettle us. He became a legal category before he could become a remembered human being. The system absorbed him. His individuality dissolved into precedent. But precedent can be traced, and when traced, it reveals architecture. A colonial decision became a canatelisturm. By the early 1700s, what began as a local ruling in a Virginia courtroom was no longer local. It had become contagious. The legal logic that separated John Punch from the European men who ran beside him, that quiet decision to assign lifetime servitude to the African body, had taken root. And once rooted in Virginia, it did not remain there. The American colonies were expanding. Tobacco profits were rising. Land was being cleared at extraordinary speed. Labor demand intensified. The plantation economy proved enormously lucrative, but it required something critical: predictability. Investors wanted assurance that labor would not disappear when contracts expired. They wanted permanence, and Virginia had already begun designing permanence. Other colonies watched carefully. Maryland adopted similar slave codes. The Carolinas expanded them. Georgia followed. By the early 18th century, racial slavery was no longer experimental. It was institutional. The Atlantic slave trade surged in coordination with these laws. Ships departed from West Africa, crossed the Middle Passage under brutal conditions, and arrived in American ports carrying human cargo destined for fields that now operated under permanent bondage. The economic scale exploded. Slavery was no longer a colonial inconvenience. It was a transatlantic industry. And behind that industry stood law. Not chaos, not randomness. Structure. The hereditary statutes Virginia pioneered ensured that enslaved populations would replenish internally. Children were born into bondage automatically. Slaveholders no longer depended solely on imports. A self-sustaining labor force had been engineered. The brilliance and horror of the system lay in its efficiency, when race became identity. As the 18th century advanced, something else crystallized. Whiteness and blackness stopped functioning merely as descriptions of appearance. They became legal identities. White colonists, regardless of wealth, now belonged to a protected category. They could testify in court. They could bear arms. They could own land. They could not be enslaved for life. Africans and their descendants were denied those protections by statute. This distinction did more than regulate labor. It reshaped self-perception. Poor European settlers, once marginalized and disposable, were elevated socially above enslaved Africans. The psychological shift was powerful. Even if their material conditions remained difficult, their racial status granted them superiority. This was not accidental. It was governance strategy. Division prevents coalition. The ruling elite had learned from Bacon's rebellion. Class unity threatened power. Racial hierarchy preserved it. By embedding race into law, colonial leadership ensured that solidarity between poor whites and enslaved Africans would fracture. John Punch's sentence had been an early rehearsal for that division. Now it was permanent doctrine. The founding fathers inherit the system. By the time the American Revolution ignited in 1776, racial slavery had been embedded for over a century. Generations had been born into it. Wealth had been accumulated through it. Political compromise revolved around it. When the Declaration of Independence proclaimed that all men are created equal, it did so within a society structurally dependent on enslaved labor. This contradiction did not emerge spontaneously. It had roots stretching back to 1640. The men who drafted the Constitution inherited a slave system already mature. They debated it, protected it, compromised around it. the Three-Fifths Compromise, the protection of the slave trade until 1808, and fugitive slave clauses were not accidents. They were accommodations of an institution deeply woven into economic and political life. The irony is stark. A nation born proclaiming liberty had already normalized hereditary racial bondage before it existed as a nation, and that normalization traces backward through slave codes, through hereditary statutes, through strategic racial divisions, all the way to a colonial courtroom where one man's sentence differed from two others. The global context. While America was shaping its racial caste system, European powers were building global empires fueled by enslaved labor. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, silver mines in South America, cotton fields in the American South. The Atlantic world became an interconnected web of commerce and coercion, yet what distinguished the American colonies, and later the United States, was the durability of the racial framework they created. Slavery was not merely economic. It became ideological. Scientific racism emerged to rationalize it. Religious justifications were crafted. Cultural narratives solidified. Law had created the category. Ideology came later to defend it. The pattern is crucial to understand. Prejudice did not invent the law. Law institutionalized prejudice. Then prejudice expanded to justify the law. John Punch's case marks the moment when that cycle visibly began. The silence in the records. There is no evidence that John Punch witnessed the rise of global slave markets. There is no indication that he saw the constitutional debates of the 1780s. He likely died decades before those events. But his lifetime sentence lived on, not in speeches, not in monuments, but in legal DNA. Every enslaved child born in Virginia after hereditary statutes were enacted inherited a condition that was, in part, foreshadowed by Punch's ruling. His name appears only briefly in colonial records. Yet the impact of that record stretches across centuries, the suspensest of American identity. By the early 19th century, slavery was not peripheral to America. It was foundational. Cotton had become king. Southern wealth soared. Political tensions simmered between free and slave states. The moral debate intensified, but beneath all that visible conflict remained a quieter truth. Racial hierarchy had been normalized through incremental legal decisions long before the nation's founding. The Civil War would later be framed as a battle over union and slavery. But the origin story of that slavery's racial permanence lies far earlier, not on battlefields, but in courtrooms, and that makes John Punch's story uniquely unsettling. He did not command armies. He did not draft declarations. He did not write pamphlets. He was a laborer who ran, and when he was caught, the punishment he received became blueprint. The growing tension. As America expanded westward in the 1800s, the question of slavery's expansion tore the nation apart. New territories forced new compromises. Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska. The argument was no longer whether slavery existed. It did. The argument was whether it would spread. Yet the deeper question was whether the racial logic embedded since the 1600s would define the entire republic. John Punch's case had introduced the possibility of permanent racial servitude. By the 19th century, that possibility was entrenched reality, and reality was heading toward collision when the system faced its own reflection. By the early 1800s, the structure that had quietly begun in the 17th century was no longer subtle. It was vast. Enslaved people numbered in the millions. Cotton exports powered global industry. Political compromise revolved around preserving balance between free and slave states. Yet beneath this economic dominance, something else was growing, a moral unease that refused to remain silent. The abolitionist movement did not appear suddenly. It emerged from religious revivals, Enlightenment ideals, and the lived testimony of formerly enslaved people who risked everything to speak. Men and women who had escaped bondage began publishing narratives that exposed the brutality hidden behind plantation wealth. Their accounts disrupted carefully maintained illusions. They described family separations, forced labor, violence, and the legal machinery that upheld it all. For over a century, racial slavery had been justified through law. Now it was being challenged through conscience. Abolitionists argued that the nation's founding principles, liberty, equality, natural rights, could not coexist with permanent racial bondage. They forced Americans to confront a contradiction that had been embedded since colonial times, when activists demanded emancipation. They were not only opposing contemporary plantation practices, they were questioning the legal architecture that stretched back to the earliest statutes of Virginia. And in the background of every argument lay a silent historical reality. Racial permanence had not always existed. It had been constructed. The courtroom that sentenced John Punch had set a precedent. The slave codes had solidified it. The Constitution had accommodated it. But nothing written by human hands is immune from challenge. The moral awakening intensified through the 1830s and 1840s. Abolitionist newspapers circulated widely. Churches split over the issue. Northern states gradually abolished slavery within their borders. Underground networks formed to assist fugitives seeking freedom, and every fugitive who ran north was, in a sense, defying the same logic that had once defined Punch's fate. The logic that said African descent meant permanent servitude, but the system did not loosen easily. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 strengthened federal enforcement, compelling citizens even in free states to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. The nation was forced to confront slavery not as a distant Southern institution, but as a legal obligation embedded in federal authority. Tension escalated. Political compromises failed. Violence erupted in Kansas over whether the territory would permit slavery. Congressional debates grew hostile. The nation's divisions sharpened. Then, in 1861, war began. The Civil War, a reckoning centuries in the making. The American Civil War is often framed as a sectional conflict between North and South, but at its core, it was a reckoning with a system whose roots ran back to the 1600s. When President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, it marked a turning point. It redefined the war as a fight against slavery itself. Enslaved people fled plantations in massive numbers, seeking protection behind Union lines. Their actions transformed the war from political struggle into social revolution. The 13th Amendment in 1865 formally abolished slavery throughout the United States. On paper, the system that had grown from colonial statutes was dismantled. But consider the scale of what had to be undone. 2 centuries of legal reinforcement, generations born into hereditary bondage, an economy structured around unpaid labor, an ideology constructed to defend racial hierarchy. The end of slavery was not simply the end of an institution. It was the collapse of a legal architecture first sketched in moments like the sentencing of John Punch. Freedom and its limits. Emancipation did not instantly produce equality. Reconstruction attempted to redefine citizenship and rights for formerly enslaved people. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting protections. Black legislators entered office. Schools were established. Communities rebuilt. But backlash emerged swiftly. White supremacist groups formed to resist political change. Southern states enacted black codes and later Jim Crow laws to restrict freedom. Economic systems like sharecropping trapped families in cycles of debt. The prison system evolved to exploit forced labor through convict leasing. Slavery had been abolished. Racial hierarchy had not. The legal system that once declared permanent servitude based on race had been dismantled, yet its ideological residue lingered. The shadow of 1640 stretched forward, the long memory of law. It is easy to view John Punch as an isolated colonial figure, a footnote in early American history, but his case represents something deeper. The moment law chose race as determinant of permanence. Once race became legally meaningful in that way, it influenced everything that followed. Citizenship definitions, property rights, voting access, marriage restrictions, educational segregation. Even after slavery ended, racial distinctions embedded in law continued shaping American life. Legal precedent has memory, and systems rarely disappear cleanly. A symbolic reversal centuries after Punch's lifetime sentence, genealogical research suggested a remarkable connection. Through DNA analysis, scholars proposed that Punch may be a distant ancestor of Barack Obama via lineage connected to the family of Punch's enslaver. If accurate, the symbolism is extraordinary. A man sentenced to permanent servitude in 1640, a descendant elected president of the United States in 2008. The arc of history does not erase injustice, but it can expose its absurdity. The same nation that codified racial bondage also witnessed its descendants rise to its highest office. History does not move in straight lines. It curves, bends, fractures, and sometimes corrects. The suspense is the remnants. But here is the question that lingers after emancipation, after Reconstruction, after civil rights legislation. If a system can be built incrementally through law, can inequality also persist incrementally through law? The answer requires vigilance. Because the story of John Punch teaches us that transformation often begins quietly, in a courtroom, with a sentence, with ink on paper, and dismantling such transformation requires more than proclamation. It requires sustained commitment. We have traveled from a colonial courtroom in 1640 to the aftermath of Civil War and beyond, but we are not finished. The name that history almost erased. For centuries, John Punch was not a household name. He did not appear in textbooks. He did not anchor museum exhibits. He did not become a symbol in political speeches. His name existed quietly inside colonial court records, thin ink on aging paper, archived and largely unnoticed. That silence is not accidental. History often remembers those who command, legislate, or rebel dramatically. It less often remembers those whose suffering became structural precedent. John Punch did not leave a narrative account. He did not write memoir. He did not lead uprising. He became law before he could become legend. It was historians, patient, archival historians, who later rediscovered the significance of his case. In the 20th century, scholars examining early Virginia court documents began tracing how racial distinctions hardened over time. When they revisited the 1640 ruling, they recognized something pivotal. This was not merely a punishment. It was differentiation. 3 men committed the same act. 2 were punished temporarily. 1 was condemned for life. That disparity marked one of the earliest documented legal distinctions based explicitly on race in English North America, and once identified, it reframed the origin story of American slavery. Slavery did not emerge fully formed in 1619 when the first Africans arrived in Virginia. It evolved. It hardened. It was shaped by rulings like this. John Punch's sentence became a historical marker, not the first presence of African labor, but one of the first clear legal separations, and that separation mattered. Why his story stayed quiet? There is another reason his name remained obscure. Origin stories are uncomfortable. It is easier to believe slavery was inevitable. It is easier to assume it was imported whole from European practice. It is easier to detach its beginnings from American soil. But the Punch ruling forces confrontation. It shows slavery's racial permanence was not simply inherited. It was constructed in colonial courts. It was debated, adjusted, refined. It was American law shaping American reality, recognizing that challenges the myth that racial slavery was an accidental byproduct of global trade. It reveals agency, choice, decision-making, and when systems are built by choice, they can also be dismantled by choice. But that requires acknowledging construction, the modern echo. The legal structure that grew from 17th century statutes no longer exists in its original form. Slavery has been abolished. Civil rights protections are codified. Equal protection under the law is enshrined constitutionally. Yet the study of John Punch's case is not about claiming direct equivalence between past and present. It is about understanding how law shapes hierarchy. When early Virginia lawmakers distinguished punishment by race, they embedded inequality in the justice system itself. That lesson carries forward. Law is not neutral simply because it is written. It reflects values. It distributes power. It defines belonging. The story of John Punch invites a deeper question. When disparities appear in legal outcomes today, what structural assumptions underlie them? History does not accuse, it instructs. The purpose of revisiting 1640 is not to collapse centuries into a single line of blame. It is to illuminate how incremental decisions create enduring frameworks. A cue yet irony. Perhaps the most haunting element of John Punch's legacy is this. He is remembered not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him. He ran. He was caught. He was sentenced. The court likely believed it was enforcing discipline. Instead, it initiated precedent. Precedent became code. Code became institution. Institution became national conflict. Conflict became war. War became amendment. And amendment became transformation. The ripple from that courtroom extended further than anyone present could have imagined. The full circle, consider the arc once more. 1640, a man sentenced to lifetime servitude. 1700s, hereditary slavery solidified. 1776, liberty declared. 1865, slavery abolished. 1960s, civil rights legislation enacted. 2008, a descendant of enslaved Africans becomes president. History does not erase suffering, but it does reveal trajectory. The story of John Punch is not one of triumph. It is one of origin. He stands at the threshold where race first became law in America. And because of that, he matters. Return one last time to that colonial courtroom. 3 men stand before magistrates. Dust hangs in the air. No one anticipates historical significance. No speeches are delivered about race or destiny. Just a ruling. Temporary servitude for 2. Lifetime bondage for 1. A small distinction. A massive consequence. History often pivots on moments that feel ordinary to those inside them. John Punch did not know he was standing at the beginning of something vast. But we do. And remembering him is not about elevating tragedy. It is about understanding architecture. The systems we inherit were built. The categories we assume were defined. The inequalities we debate were constructed. And construction leaves traceable lines. John Punch is one of those lines. The man who became a law. The Arjab speaks, how paperwork built permanence. If we slow down, truly slow down, and sit inside the archival record of 17th century Virginia, something extraordinary becomes visible, not dramatic, not cinematic, but systematic. The transformation of labor into race-based lifetime bondage was not written in a single manifesto. It emerged in fragments. Land grants, probate inventories, court fines, parish registers, taxation lists, shipping logs. Each document small, each decision practical, but together they constructed permanence. Colonial Virginia in the mid-1600s was precarious. Mortality rates were staggering. Disease could wipe out entire households. Labor was expensive. Tobacco exhausted soil quickly, forcing constant westward expansion. Planters needed a workforce that would not disappear after 4 or 7 years of indenture. And indentured European servants, once freed, competed for land and resources. The system was unstable. Early records show Africans in Virginia occupying ambiguous legal positions. Some completed service terms and acquired land. Some testified in court. Some owned livestock. The boundaries were fluid. The colony had not yet hardened its racial hierarchy into statute, but fluidity is dangerous to systems that rely on control. When historians examine the 1640 case involving John Punch in the Virginia General Court records, the language is brief, almost sterile. There's no ideological argument presented, no racial theory articulated. The ruling appears procedural, yet its impact lies precisely in that procedural tone. It normalized differential punishment without justification. From that moment forward, we begin seeing patterns. In the 1650s and 1660s, statutes increasingly refer to Negroes distinctly from Christian servants. Religious language begins serving as proxy for racial classification. Christianity becomes legal category. Conversion does not guarantee freedom. The court gradually detaches religious identity from legal status. In 1662, lawmakers codify a principle that would transform the future. The status of the child follows the condition of the mother. This is a departure from English common law, where lineage typically followed the father. The deviation was intentional. It ensured that children born to enslaved women remained enslaved, even if fathered by white men. That statute alone guaranteed generational continuity. The archive reveals how quickly economic incentives align with law. Probate inventories list enslaved individuals alongside livestock and tools. Women are noted as breeding. Age categories shift from contract terms to life descriptions. Tax rolls count enslaved Africans differently than indentured Europeans. Language hardens. Where early records describe individuals by name and term, later records describe them by age, condition, and value. The transformation is bureaucratic, and bureaucracy is powerful because it feels neutral. Economics. The Aegean-blind legal disigean. The tobacco boom of the late 1600s and early 1700s changed everything. Demand from Europe surged, plantation scale expanded, investors required reliability. Enslaved labor provided lifetime security. Unlike indentured contracts, the transatlantic slave trade intensified in coordination with these legal shifts. Ships departing from West African ports carried human beings into a system already structured for permanent racial bondage. Mortality during the Middle Passage was devastating, but from the perspective of plantation economics, lifetime labor offset initial cost. The law ensured that children born in the colonies would multiply workforce internally. Slave codes passed in 1705 in Virginia formalized restrictions. Enslaved people could not bear arms, could not leave plantations without passes, could not legally marry in recognized forms, could not testify against white individuals. By then, the ambiguity of the 1640s was gone. Race was law. Comparative colonial context. It is important to understand that English America did not invent slavery, but it did systematize racial permanence uniquely. In Spanish colonies, enslaved people sometimes purchased freedom through coartación systems. In parts of the Caribbean, manumission practices created free black populations with limited rights. In early English settlements, some Africans gained freedom, but Virginia's trajectory hardened differently. After Bacon's Rebellion, elite leaders intentionally elevated poor whites above black laborers to prevent future cross-class alliances. Land grants and legal privileges expanded for Europeans. Simultaneously, African status contracted. Whiteness became political glue. Blackness became legal confinement. That divergence was not accidental. It was governance. Ideology follows der Schurcher. Only after the legal system matured did racial ideology deepen. By the 18th century, pseudo-scientific arguments about African inferiority emerged. Religious justifications multiplied. Philosophers debated hierarchy. But those theories followed economic need. They rationalized what law had already enforced. The structure required explanation, so explanation was manufactured. The 1640 ruling did not claim African inferiority. It did not require it. It simply imposed permanence. Later generations built intellectual scaffolding around that permanence to protect it from moral scrutiny. The founding era inherits the architecture. When revolutionary leaders debated independence, slavery was entrenched. The Declaration's language conflicted directly with inherited legal reality, yet compromise prevailed. The Constitution protected the slave trade temporarily. It included fugitive slave clauses. It counted enslaved persons fractionally for representation. These were not new inventions. They were continuations. The legal DNA stretched back through statutes, through codes, through the principle of hereditary status, through differentiated punishment, back to that early courtroom. The silverware astucial rilla called Cauliza. By the 19th century, slavery had expanded geographically and economically, beyond what colonial legislators could have imagined. Cotton profits soared. Industrialization in the North relied indirectly on Southern production. Political compromises delayed reckoning, but delay does not dissolve contradiction. When war erupted in 1861, it was not merely a sectional dispute. It was structural collapse under accumulated tension. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery formally in 1865, yet abolition did not erase the categories constructed over 2 centuries. Reconstruction attempted reintegration. It introduced citizenship amendments. It sought equal protection, but legal equality does not automatically dismantle social architecture. Reconstruction, retreat, and residue. After federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, New forms of legal restriction emerged. Black codes evolved into Jim Crow laws. Segregation hardened. Voting rights were suppressed. Though slavery was gone, racial hierarchy adapted. The 17th century distinction between temporary European servitude and permanent African bondage had seeded a mindset that outlived the institution itself. The residue remained in housing policy, labor access, education systems, and criminal justice disparities. This is not a claim of direct legal continuity from 1640 to the present. It is recognition that foundational structures influence long-term patterns. Systems shape expectations. Expectations shape institutions. Institutions shape outcomes. The archival silence. Despite the enormous structural impact of the 1640 ruling, John Punch's personal story remains largely unknown. We do not know whether he lived decades or years after sentencing. We do not know whether he had descendants. We do not know whether he ever heard the later statutes that would expand what was done to him. The archive preserves the punishment. It does not preserve the man, and that absence matters. Because it reminds us that systemic change often consumes individual memory. Why? This Rougeon story matters. Understanding the development of racial slavery is constructed, not inevitable. Shifts perspective. It shows contingency. It reveals choice. It demonstrates that hierarchy required maintenance. And if constructed systems require maintenance, they can also be re-examined. History does not dictate present policy, but it clarifies how structures emerge, and clarity is powerful. The 1705 slave codes, where the system located into place. By the early 18th century, Virginia no longer experimented with racial distinction. It codified it fully. The culmination of decades of incremental rulings, including the 1640 case involving John Punch, emerged in one of the most consequential legislative frameworks in colonial American history, the 1705 Virginia Slave Codes. These laws did not invent slavery. They organized it. They did not create racial hierarchy from nothing. They hardened it beyond ambiguity. And they did so with bureaucratic precision. The 1705 codes consolidated earlier statutes into a comprehensive legal architecture that defined who could be enslaved, who could not, and how those classifications would be enforced. The language is revealing. Africans and their descendants were explicitly categorized as real estate. Property for life. Baptism no longer altered status. Conversion to Christianity provided no legal pathway to freedom. Religious identity, once briefly a variable, was permanently severed from legal standing. The codes restricted movement. Enslaved individuals required written passes to travel. Patrol systems were formalized to monitor and capture fugitives. Armed resistance by enslaved people justified lethal response without criminal penalty for the enslaver. Interracial marriage was prohibited. Sexual relations across racial lines were criminalized. Though enforcement often punished black individuals more harshly than whites, the law reinforced racial boundaries not only in labor, but in intimacy. Most tellingly, the codes legally clarified that European servants could not be enslaved for life under similar circumstances. Temporary indenture remained available to whites. Permanence remained reserved for Africans and their descendants. The separation first visible in Punch's sentencing was now absolute. Inventory assevent. The economic record. If the slave codes show us the legal skeleton of racial slavery, plantation inventories show us its economic muscle. Probate records from the early 1700s list enslaved individuals alongside livestock, furniture, land parcels, and tools. The format is strikingly uniform. Negro man, age 25. Negro wench child. Boy, approximately 10 years. Values are assigned in pounds sterling. Women are sometimes described with annotations indicating reproductive potential, an unspoken acknowledgement that the 1662 hereditary statute had turned childbirth into capital growth. Account books reveal annual calculations of productivity. Tobacco yields correlated with labor counts. Insurance valuations sometimes included enslaved people as assets. Financial instruments were built on human bodies. This was not disorder, it was organized extraction. And organization required predictability, precisely what lifetime racial slavery provided. The transatlantic comparison, Virginia was not alone in codifying racial bondage. British Caribbean colonies, especially Barbados and Jamaica, developed brutal plantation systems centered on sugar production. In fact, Barbados influenced Virginia's legal development. Many early Virginia legislators studied Caribbean slave laws when drafting their own statutes. However, there was a difference in demographic composition. Caribbean colonies often had black majorities due to import scale and high mortality. Virginia's enslaved population gradually grew internally due to hereditary law and comparatively lower mortality rates. This internal reproduction made the American system distinct. The enslaved population became self-sustaining. The law did not merely regulate trade. It engineered demographic continuity. That continuity traces its conceptual roots back to the moment when lifetime servitude was racialized. Whiteness as political identity. One of the most profound consequences of the slave codes was the stabilization of whiteness as a legal and political identity. In early Virginia, poor Europeans were vulnerable. They could be whipped, punished harshly, or extended in service terms. But by the 1700s, legal differentiation solidified their superiority over enslaved Africans. Regardless of economic status, whiteness became shield. It did not eliminate class struggle. It did not equalize wealth, but it provided legal security. This shift prevented future cross-racial rebellions like Bacon's Rebellion. Elite lawmakers had learned that economic exploitation could continue safely if racial lines divided laboring populations. This is structural genius and structural cruelty intertwined. The philosophical shift. As the 18th century progressed, Enlightenment philosophy spread through colonial intellectual circles. Ideas about liberty, natural rights, and representative government gained traction. Yet these ideals coexisted with codified racial slavery. This contradiction required reconciliation. Some colonists resolved it by redefining who qualified as fully human under political theory. Others compartmentalized. Still others openly defended slavery as economic necessity. The law remained clear. Africans were property. The philosophy bent around the law rather than dismantling it, from slavery to convinced. Listening after emancipation in 1865, slavery ended legally. But the economic demand for controlled labor did not vanish. Southern states quickly developed black codes and later convict leasing systems. Under these systems, incarcerated individuals, disproportionately black men, were leased to private enterprises for labor. While not identical to slavery, convict leasing replicated key economic features: forced labor, profit extraction, minimal legal protection. The pattern is familiar. When permanent racial bondage ended, new legal mechanisms adapted to maintain labor control. Again, law-shaped outcome. The long arc from 1640 to Reconstruction demonstrates that legal architecture does not disappear. It transforms. Genealogy and historical irony. Modern DNA research and genealogical scholarship suggests that descendants of John Punch may exist within lineages historically identified as white, including connections to the family of Barack Obama through maternal ancestry tied to colonial Virginia. If accurate, the symbolism is staggering. The system that defined Punch as permanently enslaved also allowed his genetic legacy to travel through white lineage, cross centuries, and intersect with modern American leadership. History rarely offers symmetry, but sometimes it offers irony, powerful enough to challenge deterministic narratives. Sturcher becomes memory. By now, the extended deep dive reveals something critical. John Punch's significance is not about personal heroism or rebellion. It is about institutional design. His case sits at the intersection of labor economics, racial categorization, legal codification, and colonial governance strategy. The courtroom ruling did not build the slave system alone, but it marked a visible moment when racial permanence moved from possibility to precedent. Precedent shapes policy. Policy shapes generations. Generations shape nations.